And this morning, we want to understand that faith also will be expressed in ways where we are called to make courageous decisions and to make a stand where we are. Now, some time ago, there was a very popular film made called Schindler's List. And some of you have probably seen that. But here is a very brief video clip from that movie. And it really speaks about the courage of one man and his desire to do even more.
Hebrew from the Talmud. It says, whoever saves one life saves the world entire.
I could have got more.
Pascha, there are 1,100 people who are alive because of you. Look at them.
If I'd made more money. I threw away so much money. You have no idea. If I just...
There will be generations because of what you did.
I didn't do enough.
You did so much.
This car. Good, what about this car? Why did I keep the car? 10 people right there. 10 people. 10 more people. This pin. 2 people. This is gold. 2 more people. You would have given me 2 for it. At least 1. You would have given me 1. 1 more. 1 more person. A person who stand for this. I could have got 1 more person. And I didn't. I didn't.
So that is the true story of Oskar Schindler, a businessman living in Poland, and he hired 1,100 Jewish people and saved their lives from the Holocaust. And at the end, he said, I could have sold this car and saved more, or this gold pin would have saved 2 more lives. I could have done more. And the ring they gave him, the insignia says, he who saves one saves the world entire. It took a lot of courage for this man to stand up against the Third Reich and to realize all the possible consequences to him and to many others. And as I read some of the reviews of this, several people wrote in, as I saw this movie, it gave me courage to step forth in my life in areas where perhaps I never would. There are lots of people who can inspire us. There are lots of people who can enable us to believe that we can do something that can actually make a difference. Because I believe we're all called to make some kind of a difference in the world where we live. And so this morning we're going to look at a young woman, a person many people have heard of, but they don't really know her very well. A young Jewish woman whose name was Esther. And we just read a small caption in the scripture reading this morning. But her story goes back 2,500 years from today. She lived around 470 BC. And she is a young Israeli woman living in Persia. As we look at her story, and her story is remembered even to this day by the Jewish community, because once a year they will celebrate what is called the Feast of Purim, or the Feast of Lots. It's a time of great celebration. It's a time of giving gifts to one another. It's a time of gathering with family and having a great time with each other. But the opening text that we read this morning tells us a lot about life as it was 2,500 years ago in this country. Some of the names of the people are not familiar to us. The name of the king was Xerxes, obviously a man of incredible power. His kingdom, we are told, stretched from India to Asia Minor. That's quite a big area to rule. We are also told that he is a very interesting person in his own right, in the fact that he doesn't have many admirable qualities. That's what makes him interesting. And all throughout his life, though he rules a vast nation, he is so wishy-washy in his approach to life. You wonder, how can he ever rule a nation? One of the things he loved to do was to tell everybody in various ways how wonderful he was. It almost reminds me of the words of Muhammad Ali. I am the greatest. I am the one. No one can touch me. And so for Xerxes, he thought, I am the greatest. But when we look at him, he has no inner strength of spirit. He needs all kinds of other people to help him to make basic decisions every day. So the first time we see him in the opening chapter of the book of Esther, he is having a banquet. In fact, in the opening chapter, there are 3 banquets that actually take place. Now, one thing you have to say about Xerxes is this. He knows how to throw a party. He really is good at that. For the first banquet lasted 180 days. Can you imagine that? That is some party. So he must have had a lot of resources to be able to do it. And so this one was then followed by a second party, which only lasted 7 days. That's pretty good too. And that was for all the common people living in the region to come and to share in his splendor and his wealth. But it was a time for him to show to everybody else everything that he actually had. But then there's a third party, and that's thrown by his wife, Queen Vashti. So Xerxes is the king, Vashti is the queen. And she invites women only to her banquet. We read, as she was celebrating this banquet, there's a statement made about the king. And it's simply this: he was merry with wine. In other words, he was almost 3 sheets to the wind. He was having a party. Well, he had been doing it for 180 days, then another 7 days, and now he's into this party. So he comes to this place, and he wants to show off all of his possessions, because that's the kind of ego that he actually has. But he wants to show off what he considers to be his prized possession, the greatest thing that he owns, and that is his wife. He didn't want to show off her intellect. He didn't want to show other people what her personality was like. He just wanted everyone to see how beautiful she was and that she was his. And so in our common parlance today, what would she be called? A trophy wife. You all know that. She's a trophy wife. And so he asks her to come before all of his friends so that he can put her on display. Walk her down the runway, as we might say, so that people can see what she is really like. And so we read in verse 11 these words. He wanted her to come in order to show the people and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. So what would you do if your husband said, I want to show you off at the office, or I'm going to invite people over and would like you to do a little demonstration of what you're really like? You might tell him, get lost, or something more polite. She refused to come. Now remember, this is the king who has authority over the land from India to Asia Minor. And she refuses to be treated in that manner, that she is somehow just property that can be bought and sold and put on display for people to admire. And when she refuses to come to her husband's request, we are told this in the text. He burns with anger. It is just smoldering. It becomes like a raging fire that is within him. He is so mad, he doesn't know what to do. So he wonders, I wonder what people think. Here I am, the most powerful man in the world, and I can't control my own wife. Now, some of you are thinking, sitting here, probably thinking, so who is going to control us? Are we meant to be controlled by other people? To be treated like chattel, property that can be bought and sold? You ever notice when you get angry, you want to get back? You would like to get even? And so he wants to get back because he is burning with anger. But remember, he doesn't know how to make decisions. So he consults with the experts in the law. And the experts in the law give him this advice. Issue a royal decree which cannot be repealed. Put it under the law of the Medes and Persians. And that was the declaration saying, once this is made known, it can never be taken back. You have to go through with it. And the law is that Vashti, the queen, is never to enter the presence of the king. And let the king give her position to someone who is better than she is. And then I love this statement which they make. I don't understand how their thinking can be so skewed. Then all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Now, they might bow down and they might do homage because they have to, but inside there is no respect that is going on. The king agrees, and the decision is made that he will depose his wife. So the party is now over. He now has a chance to sober up from all those days, weeks, and even months of partying. His anger has subsided, and he realizes, what have I done? I no longer have a queen. I no longer have a wife. She can no longer come into my presence because I have issued this decree which cannot be repealed. So the wise men, the really wise men, in fact, they're not the brightest lights in the chandelier, but they're the ones he consults. They give him a new plan. Search for a new queen. What's going to be her number one criteria? Intellect? Personality? These guys haven't learned. It's going to be, she has to be the most beautiful in the whole world. And so an edict is sent out over the land, and there are 127 provinces. It's a vast territory. And one woman will be selected from each province, and from the 127 women, the king will choose one to be his new wife. In the end, he will choose another trophy wife. There's one young woman living in one of the provinces, a young Jewish woman. Her name is Esther. Esther had been orphaned at a young age. Her parents had died, and she had been raised by a cousin whose name was Mordecai. And we are told this in the text, that she is beautiful. Esther makes it through the preliminary screenings. But now she must prepare herself to enter into the king's presence. This is going to be a big deal. This is not just a casual date, like we'll meet at Starbucks for coffee and have a little chat. So if you're on a first date, and it's a really special date, how long would it take for you to get ready? Well, for most guys, it would take about 10 minutes, I think. And that's really on a special date. But I have heard that some others might take an hour or 2 hours, 3 hours or 4 hours. I'm thinking, well, 2 hours, I could play 2 games of hockey. 4 hours, I could almost play 18 holes of golf and still be ready for the date. For Esther, the preparation is 12 months. 12 months of beauty treatments in order for her to actually enter into the presence of the king. So let's face it, that's a lot of pressure on a first date. How am I going to look? And she is the one out of the 126 other contestants who captures the king's heart. And he takes her as the queen. Now here's the question. Did they live happily ever after? It sounds like a nice story, doesn't it? But the fact is, they did not quite live happily ever after. Xerxes, as the king, had a senior official in his government, a man that he had honored because of his work, and his name was Haman. And Haman had reached the pinnacle of power amongst all the nobles. He was considered the greatest. And because he had such power in the kingdom, wherever he went, when people saw him, they had to literally bow and pay homage to this man. And he loved that recognition. Can you imagine if you're walking down the street here in town and people know about you, that you are regarded in such a way that everyone bows and says, "Good morning, sir," or "madam," and they treat you with the utmost of respect. Everybody did it, except one man. One man. His name is Mordecai. This is the cousin of Esther. He is the man who had raised her since she had been an orphan. Now, it's interesting about Mordecai that on one occasion he had heard about an attempted assassination on the king's life, and he reported it to the officials, and 2 captains of the king's guard were found to be guilty of attempting as an assassination. He had literally saved the king's life. But this was the man who refused to bow before Haman, and that was considered intolerable. And this is what we read about Haman's reaction. He is so angry. Everybody else will bow, but there's one man. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay homage to him, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. He looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire kingdom. Can you imagine the rage of that man wanting to do that? When Mordecai hears of this plan, he is devastated. Because what happened was, Haman was able to convince the king to sign a decree to get rid of all the Jews. And it was signed with the same seal with the laws of the Medes and Persians. The same seal that got rid of his wife. And so the Jewish people are in a desperate, desperate place. When Mordecai hears this, what does he do? We read this. When he learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes, which in that day and in that culture was a sign of grief and mourning. And he went out into the city wailing and weeping bitterly because he knew that their lives were going to come to an end. The wailing and weeping, sackcloth and ashes, I suppose, could be a way of protest, but he knows that it's going to do very little in the very end. But if the people of Israel are going to be saved, the people who are living in that empire who are Jewish, he believes there is only one hope, and that hope is through Esther, the new queen. Mordecai tells Esther that she is the only one who can turn the king's heart around. Now imagine if you were brought before your cousin, and he says to you, you are the only person who can turn the heart of the king so that your people can be saved. What would you do? How would you feel? Well, she was afraid. Because Esther knows what happened to Vashti. She was banned from the presence of the king. And she also knows this, that according to the custom of that day, you were never permitted to approach the king on your own recognizance. If you did, and the king did not accept you, the sentence was death. And so she knows that there's a possibility that even if she goes to see the king, he might require her death. But there's one exception. If when she enters in, the scepter that he is holding, he extends it towards her, she is home free. She can come into his presence. Now, Esther has not seen the king for a long time. Even though they're husband and wife, he has not seen her for a long time. And so, we're not really sure what she's going to do. There'll be lots of people to say to Esther, well, we understand why you're nervous. We understand that you're putting your life in jeopardy. We'll just have to take our chances and see what will happen. But not Mordecai. He is not prepared to live with the status quo. And so he challenges this young woman. And this is what he says to her. Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. You see, she's Jewish too. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family will perish. And I love this sentence. Who knows? Who knows? But you have come to this place for such a time as this. Isn't that incredible? Who knows that you have come to this time and this place for such a time as this? In other words, he's saying to her, Esther, the entire fate of the Jewish people is in your hands. You have not been brought to this place to live a life of leisure. You are here to be part of what God is doing. You are to work for justice. You are to spare your people's lives. You are to oppose someone who is absolutely evil because you are part of God's plan to redeem the world. Now, she doesn't make a rash decision, but she takes time. And she says to Mordecai, let me spend the next 3 days in prayer and fasting. And when people enter a season of prayer and fasting, it is usually seeking wisdom and discernment for what they are doing next. Everything else they set aside to say, God, I need to know your heart and your mind about this. Because what I'm being asked to do is presenting an enormous challenge. And so she comes back to her cousin after the 3 days of prayer and fasting, and this is what she said. I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. Then listen to this. And if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. What an amazing woman. What a person of incredible courage. Do you ever have that sense of God's call on your life? That whatever He wants you to do, regardless of the cost, you will put your life on the line? So Esther prays and fasts for 3 days. She goes to the king in defiance of the law. Life and death hangs in the balance. And when the king sees her, he is delighted, and he holds out the scepter toward her. And she knows that she will live for at least today. But that's all, because the decree is still in place. So the king asks her, Esther, what would you like? Now he's in a good mood, and he says, I will give you up to half the kingdom. I don't think he'd literally give her half of his kingdom, but it's a sign of generosity. Because if she asked for half the kingdom, his tune would change pretty quickly. But you see, Esther has street smarts. She knows the king well enough, and she knows that he likes to party. So she invites him to a banquet. And she says, and bring that other nobleman whom you exalt, Haman, the guy who's at the kind of top of the heap. Bring him. And at the party, they are having a wonderful time, and they've had lots of wine. And again, he says to her, Esther, what do you want? I will give you up to half the kingdom. And she replies, what I would like is to offer a second banquet, and then I will make my request. Now, you see, there's a side story we need to understand. Haman, this nobleman, is in high spirits. No one is treated the way he is in the entire kingdom. And even Esther invites him to the banquet. And he goes out to the streets, and he's making his way home, and people are bowing and scraping and paying homage. And then he sees this Mordecai, and the guy won't even bend over halfway to make a decent bowing. And because of that, all the joy in his life is gone. One incident takes away all the happiness that he has in life. Haman wanted everything, but more than anything, he wanted the respect of Mordecai. He goes home, and his wife sees he's in a funk. He is depressed. She says, what's wrong? And he says, this guy Mordecai will never recognize who I am. And she says, honey, don't worry. They're going to be gone soon enough. Why don't you build a gallows 75 feet high and have Mordecai hung on it in the time of the execution of the Jews? So he thinks that's a great idea, and he has this gallows built outside, 75 feet high. I don't know how high it is to the top, but I'm guessing it's pretty close to 75 feet. That's a long way up. That night, before the second banquet, Xerxes, the king, cannot sleep. So what do you do when you can't sleep? Count sheep? Well, I think probably a lot of you go and grab a book. You probably think, well, I might as well read. Well, they didn't have novels, but they did have annals. And annals were documentation of things that had taken part in the kingdom. And Xerxes calls for the annals to be read, and he has a reader come, and he focuses on certain events that have taken place. And that night he reads for the first time about Mordecai actually saving his life from assassination. And he asks this question, was this man ever honored? Was this man ever honored? And the reader says, no. It was never acknowledged. It was never honored. The next morning, as the king is going out, he runs into Haman. And he thinks, well, here's the man who is high up in our government, who knows a lot of things. He is wise. And he says to Haman, what should be done for a man who honors the king? And Haman's thinking to himself, that must be me. I am a man that the king would want to honor. And he said, well, here's my suggestion. Put on royal robes on this man, put him on the most beautiful horse you have that a nobleman lead him through the city and loudly proclaim, this is how the king honors those who have honored him. And the king says, that is a fantastic idea. I want you to do that to Mordecai. You see the irony of it all? And so he has to get these royal robes put on Mordecai, place him on a horse, and he's leading him through the town and honoring him when he thinks this guy should be honoring him. He is so humiliated. And so at the banquet, when this event is all over, Esther tells the king, this is what I would like, that my people can be spared, because an edict has been written and signed by you that the Jewish people are to be exterminated. Well, the king is kind of shocked. He probably signs lots of documents, not even knowing what he's signing. It's a huge nation. The Jewish people are only a small sector of the people. And he said, well, who did this? And she said, Haman, your nobleman. Well, the king is upset and he's angry, and in a fury, he walks out of the room. Haman knows that he is in serious trouble, and he pleads with Esther to save his life, and she refuses to do anything. And then he grabs her, and at that point, the king enters in and realizes his wife is being assaulted, and he flies into a rage and orders Haman to be hung on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Now the king wonders, I need a new chief of staff. He doesn't know who to choose, and he says to Esther, who should I choose? And she suggests, I know this man who had saved your life. I would recommend him as your new chief of staff. And so Mordecai now has the position that Haman did. But the edict of death remains. And Esther pleaded with her husband to sign a new order that would be sealed by him so that the Jews can at least defend themselves against anyone who would take their life. And that is done. And as the word spread throughout the nation, many people converted to Judaism in a heartbeat, and they committed themselves to God. Now the question is, how did all this happen? It happened because one man was willing to speak truthfully into the life of a woman. And he said to her, who knows, but you have come to this situation, this position, for such a time as this. And this woman had the courage to say no to security and safety and wealth. And she said yes to God to the point of being willing to even give her life. And now it's our day. What will we do with our life? Obviously, it will not likely be as dramatic as the story of Esther, but we all have a mission and a purpose here on the earth. Because our lives are part of God's bigger mission. And as you think about the story of Esther, there is so much going on behind the scenes in this book. It's interesting in the book of Esther, and that's why some people questioned its authenticity, is because God is never mentioned once. Interesting. If you don't believe me, read it through. God is never mentioned once. She enters into prayer and fasting as a devout Jew, but God is never mentioned. But God is just off stage. You can't really see him, but you can understand that he is the main character. So how is it that of all the women in the entire empire, a young Jewish woman would become a queen? How is it that of all the people in the empire, Mordecai is the one who saves Xerxes from assassination. And how is it that the king would have insomnia the night Haman built the gallows for Mordecai? And that of all the letters that would be read out of the annals, the passage that came to the forefront was the story of Mordecai saving the king's life. And how is it that Haman, the scheming murderer, would become the victim of his own schemes? I believe that the writer wants us to know that even in the most unlikely places and in the most unlikely circumstances, God is present and God is at work in your life and in mine, even as he was at work in the life of Esther. So as you go about your tasks today, tomorrow, and the subsequent days that God gives to you, think about your life and the situations that God is placing you in. And to think about this question, who knows, but that you have come to this place in life for such a time as this. It will take courage to stand strong wherever you are. And sometimes we wonder, why doesn't God move faster? Why is it taking so long? Look at the long story of Esther. And the people were not immediately freed from danger, but God is at work. So we're going to sing a prayer in a minute. I'm going to invite the singers to come up. And we're going to sing this song as a prayer that in his time, God makes all things beautiful in your life and in mine.